What if I told you that some of Utah's most famous legends are connected to real places that still exist today? From mysterious lakes and abandoned towns to locations surrounded by unexplained stories, these places have fascinated people for decades. And as we move through this list, the mysteries only get stranger. Let's explore 10 mysterious places behind Utah's famous legends. Don't forget to subscribe to Ghost Hunt for more real mysteries and haunted places. 1. Skinwalker Ranch. I had heard about Skinwalker Ranch for years before I finally decided to see the area for myself. The place had become famous because of countless reports involving strange lights, unexplained events, and stories that even experienced investigators struggled to explain. I had watched documentaries, read articles, and listened to interviews, but none of them answered the question that kept bothering me. Why does this single piece of land continue to attract so much attention? The road leading toward the area felt endless. The further I drove, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. There were no busy streets, no crowds, and no tourist attractions. Just open land stretching toward the horizon. At first, it felt peaceful. Then it started feeling isolated. As the afternoon passed, I stopped several times to look across the landscape. Nothing looked unusual. The ranch was not a haunted castle or an abandoned asylum. It looked surprisingly ordinary. Yet that was exactly what made it strange. So many extraordinary stories had come from a place that looked completely normal. While standing there, I remembered reading about local reports describing unexplained lights in the sky. Some witnesses claimed they saw objects moving in ways that seemed impossible. Others reported equipment failures and unusual experiences. Whether those stories have natural explanations or not, they have become part of the ranch's reputation. As sunset approached, the atmosphere slowly changed. The hills turned dark, the shadows grew longer, and the silence became impossible to ignore. Every sound stood out. A distant noise that would normally seem insignificant suddenly demanded attention. I remember looking toward the horizon and thinking about all the people who had stood in similar spots before me. Ranch owners, researchers, journalists, and curious visitors had all arrived hoping to find answers. Most left with more questions than they started with. The strangest moment of the evening was not seeing something mysterious. It was realizing how easily the environment could affect your mind. The isolation, the silence, and the knowledge of the stories surrounding the area created a feeling that is difficult to describe. You start noticing every movement. Every shadow. Every sound. By the time darkness covered the landscape, I understood why Skinwalker Ranch continues to fascinate people. The mystery is not just about what has reportedly happened there. It is about the unanswered questions that remain. As I prepared to leave, I took one final look across the dark valley. Nothing unusual appeared. Everything seemed completely still. Then I remembered something a local resident had once said in an interview. The scariest part isn't what people claim to have seen here. It's what keeps bringing people back. And after visiting the area myself, I still don't know the answer to that question. 2. Bear Lake. I first visited Bear Lake after hearing one story that refused to leave my mind. It was not about a ghost town, an abandoned building, or a haunted forest. It was about a creature that locals had been talking about for more than a century. Some people called it the Bear Lake Monster. At first, I thought it was just another local legend created to attract visitors. But the more I read, the more curious I became. Historical newspaper reports from the 1800s mentioned sightings of a strange creature in the lake. Some witnesses claimed it had a long body and moved through the water faster than any known animal. Whether those reports were accurate or not, they became part of the lake's history. When I finally arrived at Bear Lake, the first thing that caught my attention was its color. The water looked almost unreal. It was bright blue, stretching far beyond the shoreline. Families were enjoying the beach, boats moved across the water, and everything felt normal. That normal feeling lasted only a few hours. As evening approached, the crowd slowly disappeared. The shoreline became quieter. The wind picked up, creating small waves that rolled toward the shore. I decided to stay longer than most visitors because I wanted to experience the lake after sunset. The deeper the darkness became, the larger the lake seemed. Looking across the water, I could no longer see the opposite shore clearly. It felt as if the lake had no end. I sat near the shoreline thinking about the old reports. Most people dismiss them today, but I kept wondering what those witnesses actually saw. Were they mistaken? Did they see an unusual animal? Or was there another explanation that nobody ever discovered? As those thoughts filled my mind, something happened that immediately caught my attention. Far from the shore, I noticed a dark shape briefly appear above the water before disappearing again. It happened so quickly that I questioned whether I had really seen it. A few moments later, another ripple spread across the surface. I stared into the darkness waiting for it to happen again. Nothing. Only silence. The strange thing was not the movement itself. Lakes are full of natural activity. Fish jump. Waves create illusions. Light can play tricks on the eyes. Yet in that moment, knowing the history of the legend made every small detail feel significant. Eventually, I left the shoreline and walked back toward my vehicle. Before opening the door, I turned around for one final look at the lake. The water was calm again. But as I stood there, I remembered something a local resident had told me earlier that day. He smiled and said, "Most people come here hoping to see the monster." Then he paused for a moment. "And every year, a few people leave believing they did." To this day, I still don't know what caused those movements on the water that night, and that uncertainty is what keeps the legend alive. 3. Great Salt Lake. I had seen photographs of the Great Salt Lake many times before visiting it, but none of those pictures prepared me for what it actually felt like standing there. The lake looked endless. The water stretched toward the horizon, and the silence around it was almost unsettling. I arrived during the late afternoon. The weather was calm, and the lake appeared peaceful. At first, I understood why tourists came here. The views were beautiful. The mountains in the distance reflected softly across the water, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But the more time I spent there, the more I realized that the Great Salt Lake has a different side. Before visiting, I had read about the lake's long history. For generations, people have shared stories about strange disappearances, mysterious islands, and unusual sightings around the area. Some of those stories were exaggerated over time, while others remained unexplained. That mixture of fact and legend is what made me curious enough to visit. As the sun slowly moved lower in the sky, I decided to walk farther from the crowded areas. The further I went, the fewer people I saw. Eventually, the only sounds were the wind and the gentle movement of water against the shoreline. That was when I began to understand why so many stories are connected to this place. The lake creates strange visual effects. Distances become difficult to judge. Objects appear closer than they really are. Shadows change shape as the sunlight fades. More than once, I found myself staring at something in the distance only to realize it was not what I thought it was. As darkness approached, I stopped near the shore and looked across the water. The surface had become almost perfectly still. For a moment, it felt less like a lake and more like an enormous mirror stretching into the darkness. Then I noticed something unusual. Far away on the water, I could see what looked like a small dark shape. It remained visible for several seconds before disappearing completely. I kept watching, expecting it to return. It never did. I tried convincing myself that it was probably a natural object, a bird, or even a trick of light. Yet the uncertainty stayed with me. The strange thing about the Great Salt Lake is that it doesn't need ghosts or monsters to feel mysterious. Its size alone creates questions. The isolation, the silence, and the countless stories connected to it make your imagination work harder than usual. By the time I started walking back, the sun had disappeared completely. The shoreline was almost empty. Just before leaving, I looked back one final time. The lake was dark now. almost invisible. And that was when I remembered something a local guide had told me earlier that day. He said, most visitors leave with photographs. Then he smiled and added. But some leave with a question they never manage to answer. Years later, I still find myself wondering about that dark shape I saw on the water, and whether I was actually looking at something ordinary, or something that countless people before me had also noticed but could never explain. For Antelope Island. The first time I visited Antelope Island, I expected beautiful views, wildlife, and a quiet day exploring one of Utah's most famous locations. What I did not expect was how isolated the island would feel once the crowd started leaving. The island sits in the Great Salt Lake and is connected to the mainland by a long causeway. During the day, it feels welcoming. Tourists stop to take photographs, hikers explore the trails, and bison roam across the landscape. Everything looks open and peaceful. That was exactly why I decided to stay until sunset. I had read about the island's history before arriving. For generations, travelers, settlers, and local residents had shared stories about strange experiences on the island. Most of those stories were never proven, but they became part of the island's reputation. Some people spoke about unusual sounds at night. Others described an overwhelming feeling of being watched while completely alone. I did not take those stories seriously at first. As the afternoon faded, the atmosphere slowly changed. The bright landscape turned darker. Long shadows stretched across the hills. One by one, vehicles began leaving the parking areas. Soon, the island felt completely different. I decided to walk a short distance from the main road to watch the sunset. The view was incredible. The water reflected the colors of the sky, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly calm. Then I realized something. The silence was almost unnatural. There were no city sounds. No traffic. No distant noise from towns. Only wind moving across the island. The deeper the darkness became, the more aware I became of every sound around me. At one point, I heard movement somewhere behind me. I turned immediately. Nothing. For Antelope Island. The first time I visited Antelope Island, I expected beautiful views, wildlife, and a quiet day exploring one of Utah's most famous locations. What I did not expect was how isolated the island would feel once the crowd started leaving. The island sits in the Great Salt Lake and is connected to the mainland by a long causeway. During the day, it feels welcoming. Tourists stop to take photographs, hikers explore the trails, and bison roam across the landscape. Everything looks open and peaceful. That was exactly why I decided to stay until sunset. I had read about the island's history before arriving. For generations, travelers, settlers, and local residents had shared stories about strange experiences on the island. Most of those stories were never proven, but they became part of the island's reputation. Some people spoke about unusual sounds at night. Others described an overwhelming feeling of being watched while completely alone. I did not take those stories seriously at first. As the afternoon faded, the atmosphere slowly changed. The bright landscape turned darker. Long shadows stretched across the hills. One by one, vehicles began leaving the parking areas. Soon, the island felt completely different. I decided to walk a short distance from the main road to watch the sunset. The view was incredible. The water reflected the colors of the sky, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly calm. Then I realized something. The silence was almost unnatural. There were no city sounds. No traffic. No distant noise from towns. Only wind moving across the island. The deeper the darkness became, the more aware I became of every sound around me. At one point, I heard movement somewhere behind me. I turned immediately. Nothing. 5 Thistle Ghost Town. I had visited many abandoned places before, but nothing felt quite like Thistle. Unlike most ghost towns that slowly faded away over decades, this town disappeared almost overnight. Before coming here, I had read about the disaster that changed everything. In 1983, a massive landslide blocked the nearby river. Water began rising behind the blockage, flooding homes, roads, and businesses. Eventually, the residents had no choice but to leave. The town was abandoned, and it has never truly recovered. Knowing that history made the visit feel different from the start. As I drove toward the area, I noticed how quiet everything was. The mountains surrounded the valley from every direction. It was beautiful, but there was also something unsettling about it. The landscape seemed frozen in time. When I finally reached the remains of Thistle, I could still see structures that had survived the disaster. Some buildings stood partially damaged. Others looked as though they had simply been left behind in the middle of an ordinary day. That was the part that affected me the most. People had once lived normal lives here. Children went to school. Families shared meals. Neighbors knew each other. Then nature changed everything. As I stood there looking across the abandoned area, I tried imagining what it must have felt like for residents watching the floodwaters rise. Every day, the situation became worse. Every day, the town moved closer to becoming uninhabitable. The deeper I thought about it, the stranger the silence became. Unlike many abandoned locations, there was no sound of activity anywhere nearby. No voices. No traffic. No signs that people had ever built a community here. Only the wind. At one point, I walked closer to one of the remaining structures. The building itself was not frightening. It was simply old and damaged. Yet knowing the story behind it created a completely different feeling. I found myself wondering what memories had once existed inside those walls. What conversations took place there? What plans did families have before the disaster forced them to leave? As the sun started dropping behind the mountains, long shadows stretched across the valley. The entire area suddenly felt more isolated. I stayed for a few more minutes before heading back toward my vehicle. Just before leaving, I looked across the remains of the town one final time. That was when I realized something. The most haunting thing about Thistle is not a ghost story. It is the fact that an entire community once stood there, and now almost nothing remains except memories. As I drove away, I remembered a comment from a former resident that I had read before visiting. They said, "The buildings are gone, but part of me still lives there." And honestly, after seeing Thistle for myself, I understood exactly what they meant. The real mystery is not what happened to the town. The real mystery is how quickly an ordinary place can become a forgotten one. 6 Mercur Ghost Town. The road to Mercur felt different from the moment I started driving toward it. I had visited abandoned places before, but this one carried a strange reputation. Maybe it was because Mercur was once a busy mining town filled with thousands of people, and today almost nothing remains except traces of its past. Before the trip, I spent hours reading about its history. In the late 1800s, Mercur became one of Utah's most important mining towns. Thousands of miners arrived hoping to build a better future. Businesses opened. Homes were built. Streets became crowded with people chasing opportunity. Then, just as quickly as the town grew, it began to disappear. Mining declined, residents left, and over time Mercur became another forgotten place in the mountains. Knowing that history stayed in my mind as I approached the area. The first thing I noticed was how empty everything felt. There were no busy roads, no sounds of daily life, and no evidence that a thriving town had once existed there. The landscape looked peaceful, yet something about it felt strangely heavy. I parked my vehicle and spent time walking around the area where the town once stood. What surprised me most was not what I saw. It was what I didn't see. When a town disappears, you expect at least a few reminders of its past. But in Mercur, much of that history has faded away. You have to imagine the buildings. Imagine the people. Imagine the noise that once filled the valley. As the afternoon passed, I found myself thinking about the miners who spent years working there. Many arrived with dreams of wealth. Some succeeded. Others did not. Standing in the silence, it became easy to forget that thousands of lives were once connected to this place. The weather began changing as evening approached. Clouds slowly moved across the sky, and the shadows grew longer. The mountains surrounding the area suddenly felt much larger than before. At one point, a strong gust of wind moved through the valley. For a brief second, it created a strange feeling. Not fear. Not panic. Just the awareness that I was standing in a place where an entire community had existed and then vanished. The thought stayed with me. As darkness approached, I decided it was time to leave. Before getting back into my vehicle, I turned around for one final look at the area. Everything was quiet. Almost too quiet. That was when I remembered something I had read from a local historian. He said the most fascinating thing about Mecca is not the gold that was mined there. It is the fact that thousands of people once called it home, yet most travelers pass by today without realizing a town ever existed. I drove away thinking about that statement. And even now, one question still stays with me. How many forgotten stories remain buried beneath the ground of Mecca, waiting for someone to remember them? 7. Tintic Mining District. I first heard about the Tintic Mining District while researching forgotten places in Utah. The more I read, the more interested I became. This was not just a single abandoned town. It was an entire mining region that once attracted thousands of people searching for gold, silver, and a better life. When I finally decided to visit, I expected old mining structures and abandoned buildings. What I did not expect was the feeling the place would leave with me long after I returned home. The drive into the area felt like a journey into another time. Mountains surrounded the landscape, and scattered remains of mining activity could still be seen in the distance. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But the deeper I traveled into the district, the quieter everything became. I stopped near one of the old mining areas and stepped out of my vehicle. The silence immediately caught my attention. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small sound around you. As I walked through the area, I kept thinking about the people who once worked there. Decades ago, miners spent long hours underground, often in dangerous conditions. Some became wealthy. Others lost everything. The district experienced booms, accidents, and sudden changes that shaped the lives of thousands of families. Standing there, it was impossible not to think about those stories. The further I explored, the more isolated the area felt. Many of the structures had disappeared over time, but enough remained to remind visitors that this had once been a place full of activity. Then something happened that completely changed the mood of my visit. A strong wind suddenly moved through the valley. That might not sound unusual, but the sound it created echoed across the old mining landscape in a way that was difficult to describe. For a brief moment, it almost sounded like distant voices. I stopped walking. Everything became quiet again. I knew there was a simple explanation. Wind moving through old structures, hills, and open spaces can create strange sounds. Yet standing there alone, surrounded by the remains of a forgotten mining district, it was enough to make me pause. As evening approached, long shadows began covering the landscape. The mountains looked darker, and the abandoned remains seemed even older than before. I took one final walk through the area before heading back. The strange thing about places like Tintic is that they do not need ghost stories to feel haunting. The history alone is enough. Thousands of people once built lives there. They worked, struggled, celebrated success, and faced hardship. Today, most of those stories have faded into history. As I was leaving, I looked back one last time. The entire district was almost hidden in shadow. And a single thought entered my mind. If the ground beneath Tintic could talk, how many forgotten stories would it reveal that no history book ever recorded? That question stayed with me the entire drive home, and honestly, I still think about it today. 8. Moon Lake. The first time I visited Moon Lake, I expected a peaceful mountain lake surrounded by nature. That was exactly what I found during the day. The water was calm, the air was fresh, and the forests around the lake made the entire area feel untouched. But the reason I remember that trip has nothing to do with what I saw during daylight. It started after sunset. I had spent most of the afternoon exploring the area and taking photographs. The scenery was incredible. The lake reflected the mountains like a mirror, and for hours everything felt completely normal. As evening approached, many visitors began leaving. I decided to stay longer. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I wanted to experience the lake when the crowds were gone and the area became completely quiet. Looking back, that decision changed the entire mood of the trip. As darkness slowly covered the landscape, the environment felt completely different. The lake that had looked welcoming during the day now seemed much larger. The forest surrounding it appeared darker and deeper than before. The silence became impossible to ignore. I remember standing near the shoreline watching the last light disappear from the sky. For several minutes, everything remained perfectly still. Then I heard something. A sound came from somewhere near the trees. At first, I assumed it was an animal. The area is home to wildlife, so hearing movement in the forest is not unusual. Still, the sound caught my attention. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it lasted longer. I looked toward the trees but could not see anything. The strange thing about being alone in a remote place is how quickly your imagination starts working. Every sound feels important. Every shadow seems larger than it really is. I tried focusing on the lake instead. The water remained calm. The mountains stood silently in the darkness. Yet that feeling of uncertainty never disappeared. Eventually, I started walking back toward my vehicle. Halfway there, I stopped. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the shoreline behind me. I turned immediately. Nothing. Only darkness. Only the lake. I stood there for several seconds trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe I had. Maybe I hadn't. That uncertainty followed me the entire drive home. What makes Moon Lake memorable is not that something extraordinary happened. It is the fact that the location creates questions. The isolation. The silence. The darkness. Together, they make ordinary moments feel mysterious. Years later, I still remember one thing a local visitor told me before I left. He said, "Most people come here to enjoy the view." Then he looked toward the lake and smiled. But stay long enough after sunset, and you'll start paying attention to things you ignored during the day. To this day, I still wonder what caused that movement near the shoreline, because I never found out. 9. Fremont Indian State Park. The reason I wanted to visit Fremont Indian State Park was simple. I had seen photographs of the ancient rock art found there, and like many people, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. At first, I expected an interesting historical site. What I did not expect was how much the place would stay in my mind long after I left. The drive to the park was peaceful. Mountains surrounded the area, and the landscape felt completely different from the busy places I was used to visiting. Everything seemed quiet. Almost too quiet. When I arrived, I started exploring the trails that lead visitors toward the ancient petroglyphs. These carvings were created by the Fremont people hundreds of years ago. Some of the figures looked human. Others looked unusual and difficult to understand. Standing in front of them felt strange. I was looking at marks created by people who lived there centuries ago. People whose names we no longer know. People who left messages behind but never explained what those messages meant. That thought stayed with me as I continued walking. The deeper I moved into the area, the more isolated it felt. The modern world seemed far away. There were no crowds, no city sounds, and no distractions. Just history. At one point, I stopped near a large panel of rock art and spent several minutes studying the carvings. Some figures appeared simple. Others seemed almost mysterious. I found myself asking the same question historians have asked for years. What were they trying to say? No one knows every answer. And that uncertainty gives the site a unique feeling. As the afternoon turned into evening, the shadows across the rocks became longer. The carvings looked different depending on the angle of the sunlight. Some symbols became clearer. Others seemed to disappear. For a moment, I understood why so many visitors describe the place as mysterious. Not because it is haunted, but because it contains questions that remain unanswered. As I continued walking, I noticed how quickly darkness was approaching. The trail was becoming quieter, and most visitors had already left. That was when I experienced the strangest moment of the day. I looked at one particular figure carved into the rock. Then I looked away. When I glanced back a few seconds later, the changing light had completely altered its appearance. For a brief moment, it seemed like I was looking at a different image. Of course, there was a simple explanation. Shadows were moving across the surface. Yet the experience stayed with me. It reminded me how easily the mind tries to find meaning in things it does not fully understand. As I prepared to leave, I took one final look at the ancient carvings. The sun was almost gone. The figures were slowly disappearing into the darkness. And one thought entered my mind. The people who created these symbols expected someone to see them. Hundreds of years later, we still do. But what if the most important message was the one we still haven't figured out? That question followed me all the way home, and honestly, I still don't know the answer. 10 Escalante Petrified Forest State Park. I had visited forests before. I had explored abandoned towns, remote mountains, and places connected to strange legends. But the Escalante Petrified Forest was different from all of them. The reason was simple. Most forests are alive. This one felt like a place where time had stopped millions of years ago. The day I arrived, the weather was perfect. The sky was clear, and the landscape stretched across the horizon in every direction. At first, everything seemed peaceful. Almost too peaceful. I started walking along one of the trails that led toward the petrified wood scattered throughout the area. These ancient trees were once living forests long before humans existed. Over millions of years, they transformed into stone. Standing beside them felt strange. I was looking at something older than almost anything I had ever seen before. That thought stayed in my mind as I continued deeper into the park. The further I walked, the fewer people I saw. Soon it felt as though I had the entire landscape to myself. At first, I enjoyed the silence. Then I started noticing it. The silence wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small sound around you. A distant gust of wind. A loose rock shifting somewhere on a hillside. The sound of my own footsteps. Everything felt amplified. As the afternoon passed, I stopped near one of the largest pieces of petrified wood I had seen all day. Its surface looked almost unreal. The colors and patterns inside the stone made it hard to believe it had once been a living tree. I sat there for several minutes simply looking at it. And that's when an unusual thought entered my mind. This tree had existed before human history. Before cities. Before roads. Before everything. Yet somehow it was still here. That realization made me feel incredibly small. As the sun slowly moved lower in the sky, long shadows began stretching across the landscape. The hills changed color, and the entire area took on a different appearance. I decided it was time to head back. But before leaving, I turned around for one final look. The petrified wood behind me appeared almost black against the fading light. For a brief moment, it looked less like stone and more like something frozen in time. Of course, it was only a trick of light. Yet the image stayed with me. The strange thing about the Escalante Petrified Forest is that it doesn't need ghost stories. Its real history is already incredible. Millions of years of history are lying in plain sight. And most visitors walk past them without fully thinking about what they are seeing. As I reached my vehicle, one question entered my mind. If a single stone tree can survive for millions of years and still remain here today, what other stories has this landscape witnessed that humanity will never know? Honestly, that question bothered me more than any ghost story ever could. And maybe that's the real mystery hidden inside the Escalante petrified forest.